Hi, the poem I'm going to be looking at today is Afternoons by Phillip Larkin, and as I've done previously, I've tried to give you some images to capture some of the key ideas in the poem. There's a playground in autumn, a TV set, a wedding album, and then this picture in the bottom right of a woman on an estate with rows of washing. This poem was written in the 1960s, published in 1964, at a time when Britain was very different than it is today, certainly with regard to gender roles. The gender roles in the 1960s were much more rigid, especially for working class women. It might have been possible for women in the middle or upper classes, better off women, to have had careers, but for most working class women it was still the traditional gender roles of housewife and mother. And Larkin explores those ideas in this poem. If you already know this poem, then pause the video at this point and answer the 3 questions. And then restart the video and check your answers as you watch. This is a great way to test yourself. In fact, it's the most useful revision technique. Self-testing like this is incredibly powerful and will make sure that the knowledge that you need is secured in your long-term memory so that it's there when you want it in the exams next summer. If you've watched all of these videos, you'll by now have a whole list of these questions, 3 per poem, which you can use as a revision tool for brushing up on the poems in the future. Okay, remember my tips. Pause the video regularly and take notes. You can watch it as many times as you want. Use the layout on the next slide to construct your notes. If you lay out all of your notes in the same way on these poems, then you'll have a really good revision resource. If you find them useful, you can get copies of the images if they help your mind lock on to some of those ideas. And remember to use the questions and test yourself regularly. You can even write your own questions about the poems. Even if you just were testing yourself by jotting down the language and structural points for the poems, as long as it was a test, it would work really well to help you revise. Here's the layout I suggest. Now, this will not allow you to write everything about this poem. However, it will allow you to write enough to answer both parts of the question in the GCSE exam. Remember, you only get 20 minutes to write about the named poem, and then you get 40 minutes to compare the named poem with one other. So you are limited for time, and there is more than enough here for you to convert into paragraphs to do a really good job in the exam. Okay, a little bit of context. Like I said initially, the poem's written in the 1960s, published in 1964, and people's lives were very different. Very rigid gender roles, especially in working class lives, where men went out to work and earned the money, and women stayed home, had children, looked after the house, cooked dinner, that kind of thing. Larkin's poems often explore the impact of life on ordinary people, particularly people who are in poverty. Larkin famously said that destitution for him was what daffodils had been for Wordsworth. In other words, it was the thing that made him famous, writing about people whose lives were suffering some hardship. But overall, regardless of hardship, Larkin was very cynical about life and about love. And that persisted throughout his life. He didn't really have long-term romantic relationships, was never married and never had children. So we see this cynical view come through in the poem we're going to look at. So Afternoons by Phillip Larkin. Let's start, as I always do, with the first language point. And you'll see that I've highlighted summer is fading, the leaves fall in 1s and 2s, and hollows of the afternoons. And it's important to remember that seasons and times of day are often used to represent a human lifespan, not just in poetry but in literature in general. And Larkin picks up on that here. So summer is fading, these women are entering the autumn of their life. The afternoon of their life is hollow or empty, there's nothing really of substance there. So the idea is that the best part of these women's lives is over. The summer of their life is gone. They're approaching the autumn of their life, despite the fact, as I've highlighted in purple, that they're only young. Clearly Larkin is taking a cynical view of life here, that once you are married and settle into married life and have children, really your life is over. There's nothing to look forward to, and the best bits are gone. And I've given you that image of that swing park and the autumn leaves falling here to represent that idea that these women are in the autumn of their lives. The best bit is over. My second language point, I've picked out young mothers, husbands, washing, the television, and children. And these are obviously domestic images reflecting the boring or humdrum everyday lives that these women lead. There's no variety. It's really, their lives are centered on this kind of domestic role, this housewife and mother role. But more depressingly, it's what Larkin links these words to. He talks about setting free their children, as if the children were in prison, as if domestic life and motherhood was some kind of trap, like a sentence, like a life sentence really, and these people are imprisoned. So domestic life, the domestic image, is linked to an idea of imprisonment here. And then I'm particularly interested in this idea of behind them stand their husbands. And when we think of marriage or weddings, we think of people standing side by side. But here Larkin suggests that the husbands are standing behind the wives, that there's a gap, there's separation between them. They're no longer together, they're no longer a team or a partnership, but they've become separate, even though the couple are still only young. So I think that if you link this domestic images here to the negative images of imprisonment and separation, that the couple are no longer lovers. They've just settled down into this boring kind of everyday domestic life. Okay, my third language point focuses on the third stanza, and I would say that all of the language here is dominated by the next generation. The lovers who are still in school, representing the next generation of young people, school children, and then these women's own children, their children, expect to be taken home. The women's beauty has thickened, they're no longer as attractive as they were, and they're being pushed to the side of their own lives as the next generation comes through. So the language here is suggesting that these women are no longer in control of their own lives. Their lives are being dominated by their children, that they are supplementary to their children's lives, that effectively their lives are over and it's all about the next generation. And I've given you an image here of children enjoying themselves, still happy, which is in opposition to how clearly Larkin expects their mothers to feel. Okay, I normally only pick out 3 language points, but here I've picked out a 4. And I want to talk about this little bit here. The album's lettered our wedding lying near the television. And well, we think of weddings generally as romantic, where 2 people stand up and promise to look after one another, to be together, to support one another for the rest of their life. But here, this wedding album, their memory of this great day, is just lying near the television. I mean, it's sort of secondary to the television, which has become the dominant force in their life. But more interestingly than that, I think the album is also lying. Larkin suggesting that the promises made at the wedding, or the life that was promised by the wedding, this fairy tale existence of happiness and love, is a lie. And the album's not just abandoned, but it's abandoned because it's telling lies. Because what it promised, what a wedding promises, is an untruth. I think it's a very cynical view of life. I've given you a wedding album and a TV there to kind of jog your memory about that idea, about which is most important. Moving on to the structure points, I think the poem moves from setting the scene in stanza 1 to writing about the women's lives being dominated by washing, and moving on to the next generation in the third stanza. So we see stanza 1 sets the scene. Stanza 2 explores the women's lives and this idea of domestic drudgery. And then stanza 3 moves on to the next generation. And the structure suggests this cycle. And we realise that these children, the next generation, are going to be the next generation of young mothers who have children who are going to be the next generation of young mothers. And there seems to be no escape from this cycle, or that's the suggestion in Larkin's poem anyway. And I would definitely write about this structural point representing this loop that people are unable to escape from. My second structural point would be about the repetition of courting places, which we can see here is split between two stanzas, although the words courting places occupy the same point in the line in both stanzas. The women's generation, remember, in stanza 2, the next generation in stanza 3. So these courting places have moved on from belonging to the women, their courting places, to now belonging to the lovers who are in school. And again, courting places, this idea of romance there, has moved on to the next generation. Larkin's saying that romance or courting is no longer part of these young mothers' lives. It's for the young, it's for the next generation, for the school children, and that's who romance belongs to. So I would make this structural point about courting places being split between the two stanzas. Okay, Larkin shows us in this poem that adult relationships no longer contain any romance, and all there is boredom and everyday life. We call that ennui. You can look that up. It's a great word to use in this circumstance. And the poem suggests that the passion and enjoyment and thrill of love is for young people, in here school children. The poem represents an incredibly cynical or pessimistic view of relationships. And I would say that if I was writing about this in the exam, I would contrast this poem with Cozy Apologia, where Rita Dove presents adult relationships and the stability of everyday life as a positive, whereas Larkin sees everyday life as something boring and humdrum and to be avoided. And the poems take a completely different view of adult relationships. Larkin seeing adult relationships as something to be pessimistic about, Rita Dove seeing adult relationships as much more valuable than teenage relationships, which, remember, she sees as hollow and empty, represented by the hurricane. The thing with this poem is the reader can see elements of truth in the poem. Children can become the dominant factor in people's lives, and we all know of people whose relationships have foundered or faltered or broken up even. But the reader in 2020 sees this as not so relevant now, with a change in gender roles and with women taking a fuller role in society. And now the pessimism or cynicism of this poem can seem over the top to a modern reader. I mean, Larkin obviously captures something about everyday life and is still one of Britain's most popular poets, but here it seems overly pessimistic, overly negative, and I'm sure that most of us don't believe that all relationships need to go that way. So that brings me to the end of this video. I hope it's been useful, and I will see you for the next one.